All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to New Testament Overview, our very first evening class at BP Academy. And I really prefer the evening class. I remember I started my college. First college classes I took were all evening classes because I was working during the day, and that's where I started. So here we are at BP Academy. And the evening classes was where I also get to teach. Now also Jeff Sladko has helped me tonight, if he comes. But we also know there's 23 signed up. Last I saw, there's Jeff. See, if he comes. There are 23 signed up for tonight. I know some of the folks are not here tonight, and some won't be here because we've had, I'm having some symptoms and I can't get a test, so I don't know if I have COVID, somebody says, and somebody else says, I know I have COVID, so I can't be around people. So there's a lot of that going around right now, and that's impacting us as well. I'm Bob Carlson, if we haven't met, and this is my colleague and co-instructor, Jeff Sladko.
Hi. Hi, Jeff. Just so everybody knows, it starts at 6.
Yes, so don't be late.
6:30, like I was thinking. Bob said I'll be there at 5:40, and I went, why is he going so fast?
So that's a great illustration. If you've got a question, ask. Don't just keep that question in your head like why Bob's going to be there that early. Along the way, I much prefer to get a discussion rather than just give out material, okay? I love to interact. I don't get to do that on Sunday mornings. What do we have here?
Punishment for being late.
Oh, we've got snacks.
Yes.
So if you're there, there's snacks.
All right. And I've got a roster coming around that's on the back of a syllabus because I didn't get a roster printed out. I want to know who's here tonight because you get credit for being here tonight. Yeah, those are coming around in the basket. All right, first thing I want to do, and we're on time constraints. We promised you that this was what did I say? 6 to 7:15. So we are on the same time schedules in the morning. The evening class doesn't get extra time. If you want to hang out afterwards and ask Jeff or I a question, you can certainly do that as well. But I need to introduce you to the syllabus, and I hope everybody got copies of the handouts that are over there on the table. Okay? And if not, Jeff will get those to you if you put your hand up. For the syllabus, course description is in there and the objectives. One of the things I want to make clear is that we are, in a sense, dual track. BP Academy is intended to work through some core courses and some elective courses in order to earn a certificate. There's some core things, both in terms of these particular classes, New Testament overview, Old Testament overview, how to study your Bible, an overview of theology, a spiritual life, that we think everybody that goes through this needs to take. And then there's a range of electives that you can add to that. Other things you'd like to study in terms of topics, Bible books, also some ministry skills like a small group teaching and leadership, for instance. So we'll have some of those along the way as well. Apologetics will be one of our electives. So those will be coming along the way. Now, you can take the class for credit. You can take the class as an audit student, especially in the morning. We have people that are used to adult Sunday school class, as we've done it before, and they'll just come out of the class and they'll soak up what they can from the class. They're not doing outside reading or preparation or anything like that. They're not doing assignments, and that's great. They're going to benefit from the class. So that track is still open, but also for credit students, we're going to ask a little more of you. If you want credit toward that certificate that we would award if you complete 9 courses. 5 of those are ones we've chosen for you, like any college does, and the other 4 are classes that you can choose out of our elective stream. So if you're a credit student, there are some course requirements, and that includes the reading of the textbook. Now I'll pause here to move to the 3rd page of the syllabus. There's a course schedule. What topics are we going to be covering? And the pages within the textbook you want to read for that. We're not requiring you to read every page of the textbook. There's some extra stuff in there that you can certainly read on your own, but that's not required. We also want you to read something as we start next week in the Gospels, 3 of the Gospels. We want you to read something out of every Bible book that we're talking about that week. Okay, so before next Sunday night, I want you to read something out of Matthew and Mark and John. I'm not asking you to read all through those 3 Gospels, and I'm not even going to tell you where to read, because I'm anticipating if I don't tell you where to read, each of you will read in various places, and then you'll have something to contribute as we're talking about that book from some of those various places that you read. So be ready to have something read, and it might be just a handful of verses, it might be a couple of chapters. Read something out of each book, okay? Fit that in. And our aim for the credit students is roughly an hour of outside class work a week. If at the end of the course you tell us, no, you gravely underestimate the time it was going to take to do what you're asking. Because there's another assignment we want you to be working on along the way as well. And that'll fit into what are we going to do through each of these books. And that comes back to our course objectives on the first page. Our aim is really pretty simple. We want you to be able to describe, at the end of the course, a basic description of the audience of each New Testament book. Who is the audience? Who receives the letter when Paul writes to the Romans? Who is Luke writing for when he writes the book of Acts? Who is the audience for that particular book? What are the issues at that time that might be part of why this letter or book or gospel is being written, and are going to inform something about maybe what's discussed in that particular book. What's in it, what's not in it. We'll talk about that as we go. We want you to have an overview of the audience of each book, of the issues that are at play with that audience in the background, and thus what issues are talked about in that particular book. For instance, the book of Galatians, legalism. That's going to be an issue. We'll talk about what we mean by that as we go along. Each book has certain issues that it deals with. We want you to be able to describe briefly what are some of the answers that book gives to those issues. What does Galatians say about the problem of legalism or trying to live the Christian life by keeping law or rules? How does the fruit of the Holy Spirit relate to that particular issue, for example? We want you to also be able to say what is the unique importance of each New Testament book. What would we not have if we didn't have the book of Hebrews, for instance? Anybody want to take a stab at that? If we did not have the book of Hebrews, what would we be missing that no other New Testament book provides in the same way? Anybody? Well, then it's a good thing you're in this class. By the end of the course, we're going to answer that. Okay. So our format, book by book, as we go through, is going to be audience, issues, answers, and impact. What does this book particularly provide? Course requirements, you're going to be reading the text. You're going to do some reading assignments. We will have a checklist that we'll provide for you next week. That if you're a credit student, we're going to want you to keep track of that reading, turn that back in at the end of the course saying, yes, I got my reading accomplished. Okay? The other major assignment that you're going to have is along the way, you're going to fill out a chart. The design of this chart, I'll show you a sample. Maybe next class or the one after, but the design of it, you can do what you want with it. But I want you to provide audience, issues, answers, and impact for each New Testament book. You could come up with newspaper headlines, for instance, for each of those areas. You could just write a brief description. You could list. I don't care how you do it. Get creative if you want to. Have a little fun with it. But that's our way of hearing back from you. When you turn those in, you'll have a chance a month in or so. You'll turn in. You'll find that's due first time around is February 6th. And the purpose there is to give us a chance to see what you've done so far on those first several weeks of books that we've covered. So you know if you're hitting at what we're aiming at. It'll be a chance for us just to give you some feedback. Is that chart meeting expectations, or do we need to redirect a little bit? So we'll work on that chart along the way, and then the other main requirement is at the end of the class, we're going to have a quiz. We're going to have a workshop. Last class session is going to be a workshop in one book in particular, Philemon, and we're also going to give you a short quiz that's going to match particular topics to particular books. Which book deals with this topic in ways that, or if you wanted to look at this topic, which would be your first go-to book? That'd be no way to think about it. So as you're following along and tracking with us on the issues and answers and impact of each book, you'll have no trouble with that quiz at the end. Any questions so far about what's expected? What we're going to be doing? Pretty good? All right. Let me ask a question then. Why are you here? Why are you here? What are your expectations?
I think I've learned about snippets of each book in the New Testament, but I've never understood how they all connect.
Okay.
That's something I hope to learn.
Okay. How they all fit together. Great. I hope we meet that. Anybody else? Steve.
I'm just glad we have a Sunday night service.
All right, that's right. Tradition. Okay. So the Jewish background of the New Testament, right? Tradition. Okay. Anybody else? Let me point out a few other recommended. Required reading is the textbook. There's a few other recommendations. There's a link I give you in the syllabus to the Bible Project's overview videos. Now, you might, as we watch those videos along the way, you might say, I'm not sure, I'm not crazy about the way they summarize that particular book. You may feel like take a little bit of a twist. There's one or two books I can think of that I think, I might have done that a little bit differently, but that's okay. They do give you very fun graphic overviews of the book that'll add to your thinking. If you watch those ahead of class, you'll have something to bring into the discussion as well, or some questions to ask and so forth. Recommend those. There's gotquestions.org is another great place. There's a summary article for each New Testament book, and those are pretty brief as well. We recommend a good study Bible. I personally recommend, out of the many that are on the list there, and any of those are fine, and if you got one of them, you don't feel like you need to replace it just to please me. In fact, you probably weren't thinking that at all. But the one I recommend is the Ryrie Study Bible, and I like it because it has a little less. In terms of the study notes, it has a little less. You can see the Bible text is this much of the page. The study notes are down here at the bottom. And study notes are short and brief. They answer questions, but without going into a lot of detail. Some study Bibles are huge because the notes are half the page, sometimes more. That's great, but that's not, I think, well, maybe that's a study Bible, or maybe that's a Bible and commentary set together. But a study Bible will give you maps, it'll give you concordance, it'll give you some helpful notations about explaining some cultural background, historical background, strange phrases in the text. That'll help you as you're reading through. So a good study Bible is going to help you through all of these courses. And we list several of them here. A Bible dictionary will be helpful along the way. The Satellite Bible Atlas. One of the handouts I've given you tonight are the two maps we're going to reference tonight, and those are digital copies, which if you purchase the Satellite Bible Atlas, you also have access to a digital version, basically a JPEG file of each of the maps in the book. We've got some of these over there on the table as well. These are $20 each. You'll use this in the Old Testament course. You'll use this in the if we do a biblical geography, if you're going to go on one of the church Israel trips at some point in the future, we will use this book will be our guide, not only in the class but also in the land. It's my favorite Bible atlas. So it not only has the maps, but it also often will trace Old Testament and New Testament events through the map and discuss that for you. So take a look at that over on the table. Let's see. Attendance policy. If you're taking the class for credit, we do want you to be in class. We aren't going to do a Zoom version of this class. We are attempting to take a good quality video with a microphone. You'll see Jeff and I will have to switch the microphone back and forth because we recognize there's people missing tonight. There's going to be somebody missing next week. You won't make every class, and so we want that video. It'll be on our church YouTube channel that a few days after class you'll be able to go back and see that if you want to review something as well, and so that'll be available to you. Okay, again, pause. Any questions? Process check. How we doing? Yep? Good, all right. Okay, well, rolling right along then, getting into the topic for tonight, we're starting with Inter-Testamental Period. And that's yours, right?
Mine.
Just making sure.
Yep. All right.
First, microphone handoff. I'll get you set up here. Okay, we're just going to clip this into a pocket. There you go.
Perfect. All right. We are going to do 400 years of history in 10 minutes. So hang on. Here we go. And actually, I'm going to start just a couple of centuries before that for a quick, so that you connect what I hope you know already to where we're going to go. So start with King David. We know about sort of the history. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israelites, judges. Pretty soon they decide, we want a king like everybody else. And King David, actually King Saul starts out. He doesn't do so well. King David shows up and takes all of the various parts of Israel and combines them into a single kingdom. The unified kingdom is first, maybe you didn't know that, but King David was the first that took all of Israel as a king and put it all under one rule. His son, Solomon, shows up on the scene. Solomon goes through his 70-ish years of reign. I forget, correct me, how many years? 40 years of reign. By the end of Solomon's reign, some problems that started back in David's reign have been creeping into and beginning to cause problems in the kingdom, and pretty soon Solomon dies and this kingdom breaks in half. And in those two halves are not really halves. It's like when you're a kid and you're cutting the cake for you and your brother, and you want the big half. So the big half is the northern half. Can we put there we go, thank you. Can you throw the other one up there real quick? The big half is the northern half of Israel. So how many tribes were there? 12 tribes. 10 of those tribes are up in the north. Everybody but Judah and Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin are down in the south, the southern kingdom, and they are, instead of called Israel, which the northern half is still called, those two in the south are called Judah. So those are names you should be fairly familiar with. I'm looking around, and I think most of you guys are kind of church kids or came out of that at least. So hopefully you know those. If I say something and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, stick your hand up and stop me, okay? Otherwise we're going to keep driving through. So we've got this kingdom broke in half, okay? Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Anybody remember those names? Okay, after Solomon is out of the picture, Jeroboam and Rehoboam are the two main guys. Jeroboam is one of Solomon's generals. Rehoboam is up in the north. The two of them have little skirmishes for the next, not just those two kings, but for the next several hundred years. There's little skirmishes. Sometimes Israel gets a little bit bigger. Sometimes it gets a little bit smaller. And Judah gets a little bit bigger, but they're kind of static for a while. And then some guys, okay, big picture again. Can we throw that big? Go back to your big picture map, the one with the Mediterranean on there. Way up here in the north of what is today Iraq, up in those mountains, there's some people called the Assyrians. They are really, really bad guys. Really bad guys. The Assyrians eventually come down and take over the northern part, the northern kingdom, Israel, and decide one of the things that they're going to do as they take over Israel is they're going to get rid of all, or at least most, not all, but most of the people, most of the Israelites that live up there, they're going away. They also take some of their own people and send them down. So when the Assyrians take over a place, they kind of mix the people up on purpose, and that is done in order to destroy the old culture and create the Assyrian culture. Now, this mixing causes the people who are the Israelites here, who stayed, to get mixed in with the Assyrian people and other people from the Assyrian Empire. So pretty soon you have all these half-breeds. Now think about what you know about what did God tell the nation of Israel? Big picture. Don't do some certain really big important things. What did he tell them? Some of the no-nos. What?
Intermarry.
Don't intermarry with other cultures. What else? Don't worship other gods. Good. Okay, so what's going on here when this mixing starts happening is intermarrying with other cultures and worshiping other gods. So what happens, these people become sort of half-breeds, and they're known now, fast forward several hundred years, as a culture called what? Anybody know? Samaritans, yeah. Meanwhile, down in the south, nation of Judah, things go along a little bit longer than up in Assyria. The Assyrians took over at about 722 BC, about 539, the southern kingdom falls to Babylon. Now, this is Assyria up here, Babylon's over here in what is today modern-day Iran. And the Babylonians take the people who lived in Judah and send them to Babylon. So that's the more familiar to us of the idea of the Israelites getting taken into captivity. That's what we think of typically is that happens. So the Babylonians take almost all, again, there's a small remnant left, but most of them head off to Babylon to live. 70 years of exile, and then some of those people get sent back. But it's not the Babylonians that send them back. Somebody else takes over. So there's a whole bunch, and believe me, this is the high altitude overview, okay? There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on here I'm not hitting. So if you're like, well, what about that? That's okay. Babylon eventually takes over most of the Assyrian area. Assyria starts to fall apart a little bit internally. Babylon goes, hey, we can get in there. So they go in there and take over that. And pretty soon the Babylonian Empire is the thing. They kind of own pretty much all of it. The people get sent back. Let's see, let me make sure I get this right. The Persians then, you've heard of the Babylonians, then the Persians, and the Medo-Persians, and all that. That's all these people over here and some further over to the east. The Persians eventually take over what used to be the Babylonian Empire, and all of that was except for some of the areas down in the south towards the southern part of the Mediterranean beach here and then out into Egypt. All right. So then we're in Nehemiah in church on Sunday right now. A bunch of people get sent back into the land. A bunch of Israelites get sent back into the land. And Ezra and Nehemiah both are books that talk about that period of history. And then, let me make sure I get my notes right here. So they go back into the land. We have the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the wall of Israel, of Jerusalem. And then our history in the Bible sort of ends. We don't have much after that. And there's 400 years, some people call it the 400 years of silence because God's prophets aren't speaking anymore. And then we pick up in the Gospels, Matthew and Luke early on. And what happens during that 400 years can be encapsulated into its total chaos most of the time during that period. So after the Babylonians send back the people that go back into Jerusalem, there's this guy called Alexander the Great that comes out of Egypt, Greece. Alexander the Great comes out of technically Macedonia, which is way up there in the corner. And you have this map, if you can't see up here, you have this map in front of you if you're looking at it. And he takes over Greece. Then this red line on your map, this is kind of his initial conquest. He starts in Greece, then he goes back up and comes through what's modern day Turkey right here. Takes over, this is Asia Minor in the day, takes over all these places, then he comes kind of south. This whole area in here is called the Levant. You might see that term show up every once in a while. He comes down through all the way into Egypt, takes over this whole end of the Mediterranean Sea, and then he decides, hey, this is going pretty well. We're going to keep going. The Persian Empire is falling apart again from within. They kind of tend to do that. Empires get really big, and then they kind of crumble. So Alexander the Great gets all through the old Babylonian. Finally, the Persian Empire hits all these cities like Susa right here, Persepolis. He comes up here to, what's the name of that one? I can't think of it. Starts with an E. Ecbatana. Yes, thank you, Ecbatana. And then he keeps on moving. And here you've got, this is today, we've got Iraq. This is Iraq. We got Iran, then we got Pakistan, then we got India. He keeps on going and going and going until his army literally says, we're done. We're not doing this anymore. And so he packs them all up. Half of them go by land, half by sea, and they all go back home and they live happily ever after. Except they didn't live very long because Alexander the Great didn't make it to his 33rd birthday. Believe it or not. He did all of that. He united this entire, really the entire known world. And then he dies. Before he died, he did some things that were really critically important for what's going to happen in the future. One, Greek, the language. There's gobs of languages throughout this entire area. And he says, if I'm going to control this thing, we need to have a common language that's used by all the people. And so he gets with his Greek smart guys and says, come up with a way to teach Greek so that everyone can learn it as a second language. And so guess what we got? Koine Greek. What's the whole New Testament written in? Koine Greek. The other thing that he does is he takes all of those various hundreds of different cultures and says, no, we're all going to be Greek. There's a woman named Helen of Troy, you might have heard of her, and her name gets used to encapsulate this cultural phenomenon, and it's called Hellenization. So Hellenization is the other thing. It's partly the language, but it's cultural stuff. So things like the gymnasium, having the Olympics, doing things like schools and various other higher education activities. All this stuff is old Greece, and it's everywhere. Interestingly, Alexander the Great kind of liked the Asian way of doing things. He kind of became an Oriental in practice, but his whole kingdom is Greek, and Hellenization is a thing that's going to be really important, because when that starts to happen in here, in old Israel, there starts to be some pushback. Let me pull up another document so I don't forget what I'm supposed to be talking about here. Where'd it go? Here.
Before or after the Crusades?
This is way before the Crusades. Crusades are about 1000 AD, give or take, a few hundred years.
Before any of the New Testament.
Yeah, we haven't even hit the beginning of the New Testament. This is so all of this, Alexander the Great is just a few years after the end of what we have recorded in the Old Testament. He's in about 370 BC, 330, thank you. So Alexander the Great dies. He's either poisoned or he dies of some sickness. We're not really sure. But when he dies, they break the kingdom into 4 pieces. And we have a funny word for those 4 pieces, which, do I remember the word? It means 5. I know, it's weird. And I just learned this myself. Anyways, he breaks it into 5 pieces, but only 4 generals get parts. So one general gets 2 pieces. And so that's why we have 4 pieces, and the word means 5. Doesn't matter. And those 4 pieces are his 4 generals. So we have one general that gets the Greece, Macedonia area. We have one general that gets sort of the old Persian Empire area out in the east. We have one general who gets kind of this area down here, and you can see on your map, and this is where we're showing up on your map, this sort of grayed out area. The Ptolemy, General Ptolemy gets this area that's the Levant, the southern half of the Levant, the old Judah, all of Egypt, he gets that. And then this near the western half of the old part here is your yellow part, and that's the Seleucids. And those are the two important guys, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So Seleucids got kind of the old northern kingdom, and the Ptolemies got kind of the old southern kingdom. They fight it out back and forth. There's a gob of different little skirmishes and wars and things, but things are, again, fairly static for a little while. And then, right, there's always the and then. This guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, shows up. He's the ruler of the Seleucid part of this. He starts pushing down into this southern area, eventually gets into Jerusalem. And the temple that they built, that Ezra and Nehemiah, those guys, it's still sitting there. And it's been kind of, sort of preserved most of the time. But this guy shows up and all of a sudden decides, he's a pro-Hellenist. He wants to make sure everything's Hellenistic, everything's Greek. The Jews don't really like this. And so they start doing things like putting statues of gods like Zeus and Hermes in the temple of the god Yahweh, the Jewish temple in Israel. And it gets so bad that he eventually sacrifices, most people are saying that it was a pig, some unclean animal gets sacrificed on Yahweh's altar in the temple, and it is utterly unusable now. Now, the reality is, it's kind of been utterly unusable for a really long time. The pure practice of the the Jews' temple worship has been destroyed. When the Babylonians came in, they took all the stuff away that you had to use to do this, and they got some of it back, but not all of it, and then over time, things have been really degraded. But when Antiochus Epiphanes comes in, he says, no more Jews. Everybody's Greek. You're going to play in the games, in the Olympics. You're going to practice. You're going to have naked games in the gymnasiums. You're going to have, that's all in the nude. The Jews really don't like this, most of them, but some do. And because there's so much pressure over time, this Hellenistic press starts to change the culture in Israel. So much so that over time, almost all the Israelites kind of fall into, okay, if that's what we're doing, that's what we're doing. To the degree that the practice, when the Israelite boys were circumcised at the 8th day, some of these adult male Jews went through something called uncircumcision. I'm not going to get into details, but it was a thing, and that gives you an idea how deeply this Hellenization had taken place. They were literally going through medical procedures to make themselves look less like Jews. Really shocking. So this group decides, or specifically a guy decides, we're not okay with this. A small group of people is formed, and they start to push back.
I'm going to give you a 3-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. And it's probably really more like 10 minutes, isn't it? So they start to push back, and the guy's name is Mattathias. Mattathias takes a small clan of people, and can we go back to the big picture of Israel? Thank you. Let's see, they're hanging out up in this area, just kind of on just north and east of Jerusalem, and they start doing these little raids. And they're successful, which is interesting because it's a little tiny group of guys, and they're going against big kingdom people, big armies. But they're successful, and slowly they begin to sort of pick apart what's going on in here. The Seleucids up north, the Ptolemies down south, they start to lose control. His offspring, again, I'm skipping over tons. His offspring he became known as the Maccabee Revolution. That's the The Maccabee Revolution was when they actually went into Jerusalem, and these guys actually captured the temple back. And from there, his offspring became the Hasmoneans. So that's just a word that's one of the family names. It goes through several generations for about 200 years. These Hasmoneans who are kind of, we're going to go back to Israel. We're going to be Israelites again. They put a guy on the, install a guy as a high priest. He's not the high priest that belongs to the priestly line. He's just a guy that they all agree, yeah, that's a good guy. We'll put him in there. There's no king because they still recognize that you have to have a Davidic king, and none of these guys are David's offspring. And so the high priest kind of becomes the main guy. During this time, the synagogue sort of arises, and the synagogue is just a little group. So remember, there's Jews everywhere. There's Jews here in Israel. They're out in Old Babylon. They're up in Greece. They're down in Egypt. There's like 100,000 Jews living down in Egypt. So they're all over the place. And so these little groups become like a church. We can think of it kind of like a church. They were just little collections of people. And the leadership of those little groups, if you had 23 elders, you had a council. And those guys were called the Sadducees. The Sadducees specifically held that the Torah was the important part of the old scriptures, and the rest of it didn't really matter. And so they also had no belief in an afterlife. So they kind of were very limited in what they believed, but that's the guys that were running the show kind of within these little synagogues that started springing up all around. The big synagogue, the main one, was in Jerusalem, and the leaders there became known as the Great Sadducees, or the Prime Sadducees. I have a, let me go back here. Make sure I hit the Septuagint. Okay, so I said there's 100,000 guys down in Egypt. You've heard of the Septuagint. It's a Greek version of the old scriptures. The 5 initial books, plus all the prophets and the writings literature. So Psalms and Proverbs and those. All of the entire thing is translated into Greek. Interestingly, it's translated into Greek in Egypt because there's so many Israelites living in Egypt who don't speak Hebrew anymore. They need their scriptures in their own language. So the Egyptian leadership decides we're going to have the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek so that the Egyptian Jews can read it. This is how homogeneous this whole region has become during this 400-year intertestamental time. Let me go back, get rid of that, and I'm going to wrap up with this. We talked about the Samaritans, the Pharisees. So the last group I want to talk about real briefly is where these guys, the Pharisees, came from. In the process of the Hellenization of the whole area, there were some people who said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay the pure Israelites that God said we're supposed to stay. That group grew and ultimately became the people we know as the Pharisees. We tend to think of the Pharisees as, boy, those are the bad guys, right? When we read the Gospels, we see the Pharisees, they're always getting hit by Jesus about doing the wrong thing. The reality is they grew out of a genuine desire to keep the purity of Israel there against the Hellenization impact that was moving through the whole area because of Alexander the Great and all the guys that went after him. So that was about, it wasn't 10 minutes, it was a little bit more than that, but that's 400 years of history, and Bob's going to take over again now and give you the so what of all that.
So we'll first talk about this map in terms of geography groups. You mentioned Judah. Microphone back on. You mentioned Judah as a southern tribe, and so the region of Israel after the return is known as Judea because it's Judah it's Judah and Benjamin that are carried to Babylon. The other 10 tribes carried away by Assyria earlier. So you have Judah left, and so the area is called Judea. after the tribe of Judah. So that's the proud center. As you enter in the New Testament era, Judea is the proud center. There's Jerusalem. We have Jerusalem. We have the temple. We are where it's at. And Jerusalem as the center is also a little, they're up in the hills, they're a little separate from some of the other cosmopolitan main trade routes. They're not right on the highway, so to speak, and some of the highways we'll talk about. So then just north of Judea, you have Samaria. Jeff told you about the Samaritans. They're a mixed group, even with Nehemiah. Remember, Nehemiah won't let Sanballat and the Samaritans help him rebuild the temple. So there's already a division that has occurred. You are not with us. And that you see that play out with the Samaritans in the New Testament. When it's a surprising thing when Jesus goes through Samaria and he talks to a woman there. And this is a very strange thing. And she alludes to the distinctions. You Jews worship in Jerusalem. We worship here on Mount Gerizim. They had their own temple up to a certain point when some of those Hasmonean folks actually tore it down. And so there's these differences, there's these distinctions. So we'll run into Samaritans in the Gospel of John in particular. Most Jewish people didn't travel through Samaria. It's unclean. They would rather go around and come back in, cross over near Jericho and come back, rather than travel through Samaria. So it's an odd thing that Jesus does that. Mentioned the Pharisees, another group like the Pharisees, the Essenes. They also were more pious. They were more separate. They didn't go along with some of the things that were happening. They certainly didn't go along with the Hellenization, the Greekization of culture. They also didn't support the Sadducees. The Sadducees, you've got a handout that talks about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Those are some key groups that you run into through the Gospels in particular. The Sadducees basically don't believe much of the Bible. They only even bother with the books of Moses, but they don't believe a lot of that. They don't believe in any afterlife. They believe in very little supernatural. It's a moral religion. But we're not even sure moral for what other than God's blessing in life. They believe, this handout that I give you, this is an excerpt from Josephus, he's a Jewish first century historian. A lot of interesting things that Josephus writes about, but this is where he just gives a brief synopsis of those four groups. So Sadducees, they are the high priest leadership. Sadducees seems to come from the name of the priestly line Zadok, which the high priests from the time of David are descended from. So they're identifying themselves with David's high priest. The Pharisees and the Essenes are both the conservatives. The Pharisees, they're the blue collar, they're in every town and village, so to speak. There's about 4,000 official Pharisees, so it's not like everybody's identified as a Pharisee like people identify as Baptist. But the Pharisees are the teachers of Moses and the prophets, the whole of the Old Testament, and they believe it, and they are looking for a king. There's an expectancy, according to Daniel's prophecies. In the first century, there's an expectancy that God's king is coming. Messiah is due. The timetable of the prophecies of Daniel is playing out. All of those empires that Jeff talked about, from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks, and then another empire after them. Well, those have all played out, and so it's time for Messiah to come. It's time for God's kingdom. And there's an expectancy in the air in the first century. Nate?
You said about 4,000 Pharisees?
About 4,000 Pharisees.
Out of how, so like what percentage?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not ready for that.
Okay, and then, so there's 4,000 of them, compared to, how many Sadducees compared to the Pharisees? Like,
Sadducees were a smaller group than the Pharisee. I couldn't, again, give you a number. The textbook might give you a number on that. I'm not sure. I don't know if you have a feel for that, Dave?
I recall about 6,000 Pharisees, so it's not,
Okay.
not a whole lot of Pharisees. The Sadducees was less,
Uh-huh.
probably around the 4,000.
Okay. Okay.
so what we're talking about, all of the Jewish culture isn't represented in these four people.
No. The Pharisees would be leaders. They would be religious leaders rather than, it's not like, in Baptist circles, people might identify with as being Baptists. And then there's the Baptist pastors. careful now, but the Baptist pastor would be like the Pharisee, okay? And others, the rest of the congregation would be followers of that line of teaching, as opposed to the Sadducees teaching that there's no angels, there's no spiritual afterlife, now's all you got, but don't go for pleasure, follow God's rules for his blessing in this life, because there's nothing after. So when you run into a Sadducee, you run into a Pharisee, that's a leader of that worldview. Yeah, perfect. And the Essenes as well. The Essenes, think of the Qumran community, think of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were separatists. Now, they didn't only live in Qumran. That seemed to be a place where they stashed in those caves. They stashed their scriptures. But there were also Essenes. There was an Essene quarter in Jerusalem in the first century. In fact, the area of the city where Jesus apparently has his Last Supper with his disciples is in the Essene quarter of the community. So they were a group, they basically pulled out a temple. They didn't do temple stuff anymore because they felt the temple rituals have been perverted. They've been twisted. They are impure. They are not following it. They're not doing it God's way, so we're not participating. They pulled back. They withdrew. They would rather not do sacrifices than to do them wrongly.
So all of these four groups in their own way were pushing back against the Hellenes.
To some extent or another, yeah.
They all were taking a different flavor of, we're going to try to...
Yeah, the Sadducees are a little more, and that introduces us to some other groups as well. The Sadducees certainly found out how to cooperate with the Romans. That brings us to another group you run into called the Herodians. The Herodians are really the Roman loyalists. They're the ones that believe our future is in Rome, and thus Herod and his family line. That introduces us to a man most people call Herod the Great. I hesitate to call him Herod the Great because I don't think he was so great, actually. He was a grand builder. I like to call him Herod the Builder. He was a fantastic builder. He built the temple. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. He built a fantastic Roman-type city on the shore of the Mediterranean, a place called Caesarea. He built a grand temple in a place that was later called Caesarea Philippi. A temple to Augustus. So he built this grand temple for the God of Israel. He builds a temple to Caesar Augustus as well. Herod built a lot of stuff in other cities in the world. He built stuff in Athens, paid for by the taxes drawn out of Israel. So his people paid a price for all of his building projects. Herod was a brutal leader. You remember, the example you comes to mind, you think of Herod and his brutality, what do you think of? Killing the innocents, all the children aged 2 and under in the area of Bethlehem to try to kill the Messiah. Yeah, that was nothing for Herod. In fact, Herod locked up all of these leaders. I lose the number, but I'm thinking over 1,000 that he had arrested and locked up as he was coming near death, and they were to be executed at his death so that there would be mourning in Israel when Herod died. Because he knew no one would mourn for him. So he decided he would kill a bunch of people that they would mourn so that there would be weeping in Jerusalem when he died. After he died, they didn't follow through with it because Herod's not going to make us. So there you go. So Herod left. Herod had a dysfunctional family, and he was the center of it. Herod had 2 of his sons executed because they thought they were trying to do him in early so that they could become king in his place. At one point, Caesar Augustus says that it's safer being Herod's pig than Herod's son, because the pig was unclean. Herod wouldn't bother with a pig. He would execute his wife. He would execute his son. Think of Henry VIII, something like Herod. I've given you a picture of the Herod family tree because in the New Testament, it can be kind of hard to follow Herod. Which Herod are we talking about? There are 4 Herods that I know for sure. 4 Herods for sure you'll run into in the New Testament, and 5 if we include, no, not Herod Philip is different than Philip. So 4 for sure. Herod the Great, and then you have Herod Antipas, and you have Herod Archelaus, and then you have a grandson here, Herod Agrippa the First. So you have Herod Archelaus. He's the one that when Joseph and Mary return from Egypt, they find out that Archelaus, Herod the great son, is ruling in Jerusalem. So they're not going to stay there. They're not going to stay in Bethlehem. They head north to Galilee. Because when Herod dies, his kingdom is divided. Let me go back to that other image. I keep passing it. There we go. Okay. When Herod dies, his kingdom is divided up by Augustus, and Augustus says, okay, Archelaus can rule this part. Antipas is another son from a different, well, he's a brother from a different mother, okay? He gets Galilee, and he gets this section down here. I don't know why they split it up in that way. Rome's going to hang on to this, but another, Philip, gets this section up here. So they're called tetrarchs. They are rulers of a fourth of Herod's kingdom. So none of them are called king. They want to be king, but they're not called king. They're tetrarchs, but it seems like Archelaus gets two sections. He gets the biggest of the sections, two of the four quarters. Now, Archelaus is a brutal and immature. He's 18 or so, I think, when he takes the rule. He's not mature, but he's learned well from his father. So he's got all the cruelty and self-centeredness, and he only lasts about 10 years. And Rome is done with him. Rome's done with all the upheaval that he has caused, and they exile him out of the land, and they put in a Roman governor instead. Now the Roman governors, some names you know in the New Testament would be Pontius Pilate. And at the time of Jesus' death, you would hear in the book of Acts a little later on, Felix and Festus. And Felix and Festus, at least one of them is in this chart as well. If we go back to the chart of the Herods. So at one point, there's an interruption in the Roman governors, and they put one of Herod's descendants, Herod's grandson, back in. That's Herod Agrippa I. You're going to meet him in Acts chapter 12. Herod Agrippa I, he extends Jerusalem. He only rules, I think, 4 years. But he extends Jerusalem's walls. He arrests James and has him executed. And the Jews really like that, so he says, well, let's go after Peter too. And he arrests Peter. And then Peter gets freed from prison, and you have that bit, the knocking on the door. Peter's here, no, he can't be here. And they're praying for Peter's release, and Peter's released, and they can't believe it. That all happens under Herod Agrippa I. And his son, Herod Agrippa II, is the one that Paul gives his testimony to, helping the Roman governors, because Paul's arrested in Jerusalem, and Herod Agrippa is not ruling in that area. The Roman governors again, Felix as well as Festus, those are the two governors that are ruling that area of Jerusalem. After Archelaus, except for Herod Agrippa I, except for that brief interlude, this is Roman governors after Archelaus. So Paul's arrested in Jerusalem. He's taken to Caesarea up here. That's all part of that Roman governor. So the Roman governor's headquarters is at Caesarea, the Roman city. Herod couldn't be in Rome. Herod had to be back in the land of Israel. That's where he could have a rulership. But he loved Rome. He grew up in Rome. He was schooled in Rome. He loved Roman culture. It's kind of like you're raised in New York and then you move to Kansas. Man, if you could only find a place where you can get New York pizza, right? Okay, that's Herod. So Herod can't go to Rome. Herod can't live in Rome, so he brings Rome to Israel in Caesarea. His version of Rome on the eastern end of the Mediterranean. The Roman governors live there. Herod's palace becomes their palace. Herod's palace in Jerusalem would be the Praetorium, where Pontius Pilate is going to be, because that's the grandest place to stay. So when you're going to stay in Jerusalem, if you're the governor, you take the good digs. You don't let Herod Antipas have that. You're going to take that. So the Roman governor is going to live in Herod the Great's former palace that he built. Let's see. What are some of the names that I have missed, or groups that I've missed? We've talked about, okay, up here in Perea, this is Philip, another one of, a brother from another mother, okay? Another one of Herod the Great's sons. He's given that portion, Gaulonitis. It becomes important in the Gospels. You see a dividing line right here that comes down to the very top of the Sea of Galilee. You might see that a little bit more on your maps, your map page here. It comes down to the very top of this, just to the right of Capernaum, or east of Capernaum, and just slightly to the west of Bethsaida. And there's a time after Herod Antipas has had John the Baptist arrested and then he has him executed, that Jesus withdraws from Capernaum and goes back over to Bethsaida. What has he done? He's crossed out of Herod's territory into Philip's territory where Herod cannot harass them. If Herod has gone after John, maybe he's coming for Jesus next, but it's not his time. And so Jesus, like he does over and over again, when it's not yet his time, he just moves away. He does a little head fake and he's gone. And that's what happens there. So Philip, that difference in territory and a difference in rulers is going to explain some of the movements in the gospel. Moving out of somebody's territory into somebody else's. And Philip seems a little just less problematic than the other Herods for some reason. He's a kindler, gentler Herod? Perhaps. I just don't know that much about him. The Decapolis, the Decapolis area, we're going to run into that. That's named for the 10 leading Roman cities that are in that region. And Rome builds these cities for a reason. They go all out. These are beautiful cities. Think of these beautiful marble colonnaded streets with shops inside the porch under the columns, and there are public baths, and there are fountains, and there are temples, and there is a theater. There has got to be a theater, because the theater then where plays would go on. Think of movies today. And that's where culture was shaped. And Rome wants to bring Roman culture, just like the Greeks wanted to bring Greek culture. They wanted to bring Roman culture to the people. So basically they build these 10 model cities, the Decapolis, 10 cities. And their purpose is to demonstrate the superiority of Roman culture to all these country bumpkins in Galilee and in this area to the east. So basically they're saying, come over to our side. We've got toilets. Okay? That's what's going on with these beautiful Roman cities. So that's another area, and Jesus is going to travel through that area. He's going to go into Gaulonitis. Think of Golan Heights today. Some of these names continue over. In fact, the capital of Jordan, the country of Jordan, anybody know what it is? The capital, Amman. Think of the Ammonites in the Old Testament. The area of Ammon. That was their capital city as well. So a lot of these names still come into the present day from the past. Let's see, we've talked, okay, Perea is just this eastern side. Bumps up against Nabatea here. Little historical insight. The Nabateans, Herod is good at making links and, shall I say, diplomatic relationships. His first wife is the daughter of King Aretas, the king of Nabatea. But he tires of her. He falls head over heels for Herodias. Herodias is the wife of not this Philip, who ruled something, but Herod Philip, who didn't get a piece of anything. Herod Philip, one of Herod's sons, is left out. Well, he's not going anywhere. He's not going to be anybody. So Herodias looks for an upgrade. And she connects with Herod. And he falls for her. And he's going to divorce his wife in order to marry Herodias. Well, she finds out about it, and so she flees to this fortress city out here, and she runs down here to Macarius, the same place where John the Baptist is later arrested and held. And she flees from there. She flees down back to her daddy and tells her daddy what's going on. And daddy's ready to go to war against Herod. Daddy's going to go to war against Herod, and so Herod is having this party down here at the southern end of his area, right? He's having this party, impressing everybody because he's got to rally all of his leaders and underlings to go with him and to trust him that he's going to stand with them if they'll join him in battle against King Aretas. Because daddy's mad because he dumped his daughter. That's why when Herod makes a promise to the daughter of Herodias, I'll give you whatever you ask for, he can't back down. He can't withdraw. Because if his word's not any good, these people aren't going to follow him into battle. And he's sunk. So he's trapped himself. And he has to go through with it because he's under threat of this war that is coming against. Okay, so that's a little bit background that's going on in the different regions. You got the Roman rulers, Herod Antipas up here, who's not much better than Archelaus. And Jesus gives him no time. He won't give him any time during his ministry. He doesn't give him any time when Pilate tries to send him over there. Jesus won't say a word to him. He wants nothing to do with him. He's going to die in Jerusalem, and it's going to be Rome, Gentiles, and the Jews together who cause his death. Let's see, what groups have I missed? Any questions about the Herod chart? You're going to need to go back to this as we're reading in the Gospels and Acts, probably, because the Herod family tree is confusing. Yeah?
So is Herod the Great, is he alive during this? Herod the Great?
Herod the Great dies apparently about 4 BC. Now, some people want to dispute that, but it seems to be the best time frame, 4 BC, just after Jesus is born. Jesus is born, the family goes to Egypt, Herod the Great dies, his son Archelaus is king in this area, which includes Jerusalem, when Joseph and Mary and Jesus come back from Egypt.
Okay.
So they say, Archelaus, we're not staying in his area. They move back to Galilee. These regions, Judea, I said, was the proud center, right? We are true Israel. What did they think of Galilee? What did the Judeans think of Galilee and thus people from Galilee? Something like what Portland used to refer to over here as Vantucky. They looked down on them. Galilee was Galilee of the Gentiles. Galilee had been polluted by the Gentiles ever since the Assyrians, because that northern section was the first place the Assyrians came into.
Was it almost the in between Samaria and Judea? Like kind of the middle ground?
Okay, it wasn't considered to be mixed. There were good Pharisaic communities up here that kept themselves pure, that followed the law, but they were still country bumpkins. Can anything good come out of Galilee? Remember that line? Yeah, that was their thinking. Does any prophet come out of Galilee? That's a prejudiced statement. Capernaum. Capernaum is the village of Nahum. Yes, a prophet comes out of Galilee. Jonah is from the town of Gath-hepher, which is just a little further away from Capernaum up in this area in Galilee. So yes, prophets come out of Galilee, but they forget that in their prejudice that nothing good can come out of Galilee. No prophet comes from Galilee. And so Galilee is looked down on, and yet that's where Jesus chooses his disciples. Galilee is a little more cosmopolitan. They mix with Romans. They get along with Romans. There's a lot of trade that comes from that bigger area, that further east, Old Babylon, all the way around that Fertile Crescent, from Damascus to further on to Babylon itself, and even farther from there, that's going to the Mediterranean. That trade comes through Galilee. Levi, Matthew, is a tax collector in what city? Do you remember? Jesus finds him in Capernaum. And Capernaum, every time you cross into a new province, you pay customs on whatever you're bringing. All the goods you're traveling with, you pay customs tax on all of that. Matthew apparently is a tax collector in Capernaum, which is just on the other side, crossing the border from Gaulonitis into Galilee. So taxes are going to be collected. If you're going to be a tax collector, that's a good toll booth to have. Okay? Levi gives up something when he becomes. That's why some of this background, the geography, that's where it matters in the midst of the New Testament story. Yes?
Might be too much of a side note, but what's with the name Herod? And is it just he wanted everybody to be named after him? Or did it become a title?
Well, it's a family name, and Herod kept giving it. He gave it to several of his sons, didn't he?
Is that his name? Then he gave it to his
Herod is, yes, Herod the Great. He was Herod. That was his name, and he has a brother, Faisal. In fact, Faisal and Herod, they are ruling together for the Romans, and then the Parthians, think the Persians, they invade, and Faisal is killed. Herod survives and flees to Rome and is made king of the Jews. A king of the Jews is simply the right to go back and conquer everything and to make yourself king.
So it's not that their name is Antiochus and they just attacked put Herod on there because they...
Well, he was named Herod Antipas. Herod named his boys after himself. Herod was a vain man.
Except for Philip.
And for Philip, yeah, there's Herod Philip, and then there's another Philip. He must have liked the name Philip as much as he liked the name Herod, I guess. But he couldn't name them both Herod Philip. So it's a weird dysfunctional family, isn't it? It's like I named this son without any mind to that son. I've already forgotten about him. Already written him off, or maybe I executed him already. Yeah, it's not a family you want to be a part of. Except Herodians wanted to be a part of it. There's money to be had here. There's position and status. In fact, what eventually gets Herodias and Herod Antipas exiled is she convinces Antipas that he should ask Caesar to be made king, to be declared to be a king, the king of the Jews. And Caesar's not happy with any of this, and he sees that as a threat. You're empire building, and he's out of there. Other questions? Let's see, where we go. Time is slipping away. We talked about Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees.
I think we're on genre.
Gospel genre, thank you, yes. I didn't say much about the Zealots. The Zealots are like the Essenes or the Pharisees in that they don't agree with all this Roman stuff, but the Pharisees are believing God's going to do something about it. The Zealots are thinking, the Essenes are saying, we're withdrawing because God's going to do something about them. The Zealots are saying, God wants us to do something about it. So the Zealots are known, for instance, for assassinations. They've got these long knives, and they go into a crowd, and in the midst of a crowd, they will assassinate Roman officials and then slip away in the crowd. And the Romans respond to that by killing a whole bunch of people. But so that's the Zealots. The Zealots are also contrary to Rome, but active about it. The Pharisees are more passive. The Essenes, they withdraw both from the Jewish things happening as well as the Roman things.
So Essenes moved to Idaho, the other one's stormed the Capitol.
Yes. The Essenes moved to Idaho. They withdraw. The Zealots are the one that stormed the Capitol. There you go. Thank you. A great common analogy.
In attacking each other or an adverse, cannot speak.
How do these four groups relate to each other?
Yes.
What's surprising, you go to Matthew 23, and the Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees all come and each ask Jesus a question. The Herodians ask a question that challenges Jesus' loyalty to Rome. The Sadducees ask a question that is basically ridiculing the resurrection. And the Pharisees ask, I forget the question the Pharisees asked now. But they're asking a question from their point of view, but they're all united in their opposition to Jesus. No, they don't get along. Sadducees, Herodians, Pharisees. The Herodians are more secular, like the Hellenists. The Sadducees think of the very liberal priesthood that doesn't really believe any of this other than it's a good religion to have. Make you a better person in life. The Pharisees believe the Bible. They're certainly legalistic about it, but hey, they're under the Mosaic covenant. They're supposed to live by the law. Don't be too hard on the Pharisees. The problem is they don't see their inability to keep it and thus their need for Jesus as Savior. But no, they come from very different perspectives. They don't get along with each other, and so it's surprising when they unite in opposition to Jesus. It's a great point.
Seems like they're all offended by Jesus pointing out their failures in life, and they all respond with praise.
It seems like the comment was, it seems like they all, and I'm going to do this for the microphone, is that it seems like they all are united in Jesus pointing out all of their sin and their need for Him. Exactly. Yes, question there, Ben.
Paul was a Pharisee, right?
Paul was trained as a Pharisee, absolutely. There's a lot of Pharisees in the early church, and that's a lot of Pharisees in the church today. There's a lot of Pharisees in the early church, and that's why there's these tensions early on. Well, these Gentiles coming in, they must be circumcised, because the Pharisees are very good law followers, and they miss the turn that God has made, and that Jew and Gentile in equal standing in one new man. That's the core of Paul's gospel.
Wasn't Paul able to use how the Pharisees and the Sadducees differ on the resurrection to
There's a point in the book of Acts where he's on trial initially after he gets arrested in Jerusalem, where he perceives there's Sadducees and there's Pharisees here. And so what I can do is he says, I'm on trial for my confidence in the resurrection of the dead. He just aligns himself with a hot button Jewish issue that now turns the Sadducees and the Pharisees that are united in attacking him, it turns them in on each other. And he's sort of left wandering off to the side and out of the room, in essence. That's what happens at that trial. It becomes a big Jewish theological debate that the Romans want no part of. And the Roman governor's like, what are we doing here? That's Paul's strategy. Yeah, great. That comes up in the book of Acts. Absolutely. Okay, last thing I wanted to talk about tonight, and you read a little bit about it in the is the nature of gospel narrative and something called the synoptic problem. First, let's talk about the Gospels. The Gospels are a personal history. They're like a biography of Jesus, but they're not merely that. How does a biography of a famous historical person typically start?
I was born.
I was born, childhood, formative years. Why is that included? If we're going to read about General Eisenhower, why do we start with his childhood? That's what makes him who he later will be. Those are the formative years. Jesus is who he is because of who he is. Jesus will be what he will be because he is the Son of God. It's not a matter of childhood experiences form him.
Is that why it only told us a few stories of what
It spends very little time other than establishing who he is by birth as a son of David, as locked into the human race, and in the Gospel of John as the Son of God.
So it's basically stating what's already there instead of saying, here's how he became who he was when he was older.
Yes, yeah. The gospel writers are concerned not with laying out all of Jesus' childhood experience, but they're all concerned with laying out that Jesus is God's Son. That's what makes him who he is. Also, the gospel narratives don't give equal treatment to all of Jesus' life. They do not give equal time treatment to even Jesus' 3 years or so of public ministry. What do the gospel ministries, or each of the gospels, what do they spend the most time on? If you had to think in terms of the time of Jesus, even his public ministry, what do they spend the most time on? The final week. 1 week out of 3 years. Why do they give so much inordinate weight to 1 week out of 3 years? Because I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received. How that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. And he was buried. And he rose again, according to the Scriptures, and he was seen. That's what it's all about. And so that's where the gospel writers are going to focus. The gospel writers are writing, they're each writing from a different perspective. Sometimes it seems like, oh, wait a minute, this one seems to disagree with this one. And each of them are presenting Christ from a particular perspective. I like to illustrate this from the genealogies in each gospel. The genealogies in each gospel. The genealogy in Matthew shows Jesus to be the son of David, the son of Abraham. Because the Gospel of Matthew is about Jesus as the King of the Jews. The Gospel of Luke traces Jesus back as the son of Abraham all the way back to the son of Adam. Because the Gospel of Luke is emphasizing Jesus in his humanity. The Gospel of Matthew, what does the genealogy in Matthew include? I'm sorry, not Matthew, Mark. The Gospel of Mark. What's the genealogy in the Gospel of Mark? Where does it start? Who does it include? Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. I'll save you. There is no genealogy in Mark. Because Mark is the gospel. Well, see, Justin was about to check and call me out, so I just fessed up. There is no genealogy in Mark because Mark is the gospel of the servant. Nobody cares where a servant comes from. We care about what he does. How about the genealogy in the Gospel of John? There is one.
Oh, the beginning.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Exactly. The Gospel of John is the gospel of Jesus as the Son of God. Jesus in his deity. His humanity, his deity, his royalty, and the suffering servant. Those are the four Gospels. So each of the Gospel writers include things differently, arrange things differently. Don't look for chronological agreement because they're writing thematically. They're writing on their theme. One more illustration I should give. That people talk about the source, the synoptic gospel problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all seem very similar. They seem to be sharing material or using shared material or getting some of the material from the same places. How does all that work out? And why is it that in that such similarity, there's some conflicts? Let me give you an example of one of those conflicts. It is in Matthew chapter 20, Mark 10, and Luke 18. The healing of the blind man or men in Jericho. I'll give you two examples out of this. In some of the Gospels, Jesus encounters this man as they're leaving Jericho. In other of the Gospels, Jesus encounters this man as they are entering Jericho. Which is it? It's both. Some of you remember that from Moana, right? You see, there is Old Jericho and New Jericho. There's the Old Jericho that dates all the way back to where Elisha's spring was. You can still visit that old tell today. And there's New Testament Jericho where Herod builds his winter palace. Cleopatra had a palace there before Herod. Herod inherited it. So there's that New Jericho. It's about a mile in between the two. And so there's a road that goes from Old Jericho to New Jericho. And if you're a blind beggar and you want to catch the most traffic, you're going to set up shop on the road out of Jericho into Jericho. You see, there's not a conflict between the two. It's just that they're talking about two different Jerichos. Now, one of the Gospels says there was one blind man. One of the Gospels says there's two blind men. What do you do with that? Is one of those Gospels wrong? There's three? That's funny. When I came into the room tonight, or actually when I came back up front after Jeff was finished, I saw an eager student. Does that mean there weren't any other eager students? Does that mean the rest of you are uneager students? I saw one eager student in particular that I was thinking I was going to ask a question, but it doesn't mean that there weren't other eager students there or not. I talk about the one. I'm not saying there's only one eager student in the room. I just said there was an eager student. Great. There could have been 3 eager students, or 20 for that matter. I just mentioned one in particular. One gospel writer mentions one in particular that he focuses on. The other one expands the tight focus to include 2. Were there others? We don't know. That's not the point. So don't jump to a conclusion that because the Gospels don't all report exactly the same thing, that one of them must be wrong. When you see a seeming contradiction, there's probably more information that you need that would resolve it. Broaden the circle, widen the circle a little bit, and you'll see more to it that fills in those gaps. So we'll run into some of that as you read some of the Gospels. So the gospel is a narrative. It's not going to be like some of the New Testament epistles. It tells a story, and in the story, we're to know who God is. God reveals himself more in story than in any other form, I think, in the scriptures. I haven't done a page count, but that would be my rough estimation. That it's in story, just like in media today, they use stories to shape culture, to change your thinking. God uses the story of who he is and what he's done to change our thinking, to transform us by the renewing of our minds. Any questions what we talked about tonight? Which has been meant to be just overview, introduction to the course, introduction to some of the land, the context historically, and an overview of some of the cast and characters that we're going to run into. Yeah, Nate.
In summary form, why is it important that we know all of that?
Well, these are people and places that we're going to run into along the way. And so having a handle on some of these distinctions, starting to think about them before we get confused with the players and the events. Now when we see these players in the events, in places, some of that will come back and fill in what's going on.
So in the coming weeks, we're going to reference back.
Well, yeah, okay, Pharisees here. What do you know about Pharisees? Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Todd.
Where it's stopped at like chapter 16 or 17, and the rest of the chapters were filled in. Is that true?
Filled in.
Filled in by what they knew of the first three Gospels.
Okay, no, I'm gonna take a more conservative approach to all the New Testament books, that basically they are as they represent themselves to us. That John's Gospel is John's, Luke's is Luke. Paul did write all the epistles that bear his name. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about who wrote Hebrews. We will spend some time talking about who is Hebrews written to, because that's one of your 4 questions, right? Audience, what's next? Issues, what's next? Answers for those issues, and last, impact. So be thinking already of those 4 as we get into the 3 of the 4 Gospels that we're going to talk about next week. We're not going to try to do all 4. We're saving Luke and Acts because Luke and Acts go together as a set. We'll do those in week 3. So we've gone a few minutes over, only 6, though not too bad by Bob's standards. Jeff, would you close with a word of prayer?
Yes. Heavenly Father, you are such a good God, and we love getting to know more about you. Would you help us in the process of learning about you in your Gospels, in the epistles, and the other books that we're going to be looking at? Move beyond just knowing about you and really get to know you and make this personal. We thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to do this study. We ask for each student here that you would give them grace with their time, that the time they spend would be productive, and that as they learn, they would gain even more of an appetite to learn more and go deeper. Thank you for Bob and his leadership here, and for all the other men who are leading the process here. And we just ask for your blessing on this whole thing as we grow to know you more in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.